Well, welcome, and thank you for coming out on this absolutely miserable winter night. And I'm Noreen Hirschfeld. I'm the Reuter Professor of Science and Religion here at St. John's and St. Ben's. And it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Christopher Southgate. Chris and I first got to know each other in, of all the unlikely places, Tehran. We were both keynote speakers at the first annual conference on science and religion in Tehran at the University of Tehran. And it turned out to be the one and only conference on science and religion at the University of Tehran. But we were really privileged to have the opportunity to visit that country. And Chris and I were the bad kids of the conference, and we managed to elude our handlers and find a taxi and go off to see the sights. The interesting thing was that traffic is gridlocked pretty much 24 hours a day in Tehran. And our cab just couldn't get to the museum we wanted to go to. So he said, well, I'll drop you off here. You know, it's on the road. And we said, fine, we'll find it. Hopped out of our taxi. He drove off. And we looked around and realized neither one of us could read a single word of Farsi. And they don't even use Arabic numerals, so we couldn't even tell, you know, do the numbers go up that way or do they go up that way? And we managed to get where we were going, but I don't remember how. Chris trained first as a biochemist. He has his PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge. And then he moved into the field of science and religion, and he has been teaching science and religion at the University of Exeter since the mid-90s. He has also at various times served as a hospital chaplain, as a college chaplain, and as chaplain in a psychiatric ward. So he has a wide and varied experience of different kinds of suffering. And so he's going to talk to us tonight on a subject that I think is just very germane, given the pandemic that we've all just been through and the war that we are all following from afar right now. And that is, where do you find God and where do you find God's glory in a world full of suffering? So please join me in welcoming Christopher Southgate.
Well, thank you very much, Noreen, for that splendid introduction, and it's a delight to be with you tonight. It's my second visit to St. John's. I was here in 2013 to talk about my book, The Groaning of Creation, and it's a real delight to come back. And despite the wind chill and the rain and the lost baggage, it's been a very special to be here and to soak up the very particular atmosphere of this place, its rhythm of prayer, the lovely woods and so on. So it's been a privilege to be here, and thank you for coming out on such a night to talk about glory. So I'm going to go through a range of material: scientific, theological, biblical, poetic. I'm going to go through it quite quickly in the hope of striking sparks of interest from you in one area or another. I'm going to be talking about this book prominently displayed on the bookstall, and in a sense it's a sequel to The Groaning of Creation. So I'm just going to sketch quickly what the connections are and then to move into the work on glory that I have been developing. In The Groaning of Creation, I was asking the important, though under-examined question, how could a loving God have created nature so red in tooth and claw? and in pondering that question, I once had to point out that we can't any longer use that traditional get-out-of-jail-free card of Christian theodicy to blame everything on the fall of Adam and Eve or on human sin in general, because we know perfectly well now that animal suffering long predated the first human beings. So once human sin is taken out of the equation, then the next possibility is that some counter force or other, such as the rebellious angels, was opposed to God's creation of a harmonious biosphere, and that's why we have all the struggle and suffering of which the biological world is full. And this is a very complex issue, but I've always been dissatisfied with that kind of counterforce explanation. It seems to me that it's problematic theologically, it's problematic in terms of its scriptural basis. It's troubling in terms of the sovereignty of God, because it seems to imply that this counterforce is sufficiently powerful to distort the creation so much that God couldn't give rise to God's harmonious universe. And so perhaps slightly rudely to the proponents of this view, I asked them whether they really think that God set out to create straw-eating lions and was unable to do so. So that seems to be a big theological problem with that sort of explanation. And it's also it's very problematic scientifically to anyone with a training in the biological sciences, because it's pretty evident to biologists that it's the same process that gives rise to all the beauty and refinement of adaptation of biological creatures that also gives rise to the struggle and competition and suffering. So what I ask people to accept in the groaning of creation is that the non-human world does work basically as God intended it to work. And then I went on to do what theodicists do and try and justify the ways of God to man, to explain why a good and loving God should have given rise to such a process. But what I went on to do in the second book is to move from theodicy to doxology, to ask what does the conversation look like if we stop giving reasons, if we stop making excuses for God and just face up to the fact that the God who is infinitely mysterious and beyond our understanding has made this suffering-filled world, and to try and gain some purchase on how we might speak of such a God and such a world without trying to do theodicy, without trying to make excuses for God. So that led me into thinking about glory. Because it seemed to me that the language of divine glory is an important way in which the scriptures talk about God and God's ways with the world, in ways that acknowledge the mystery of God's work and yet recognize that that we're given signs, clues to God's work in the world. And coming out of the background that I do, I want to investigate those signs using the resources of science, but also using the resources of theological contemplation and indeed poetry. So the way I want to understand glory is this. I want to understand glory as being signs or clues that we get to the mysterious and unknowable God from our interactions with the world, signs that point beyond themselves to the unknowable divine reality. And those signs, because God gives them to us in God's self-disclosure, those signs always call for human response. So glory here is being understood as a sign of the sheer unknowable godness of God. And I arrived at this understanding in the first place by thinking about this Hebrew word. Now, I'm not a specialist Hebrew scholar, but I've always been fascinated by this word, kavod, which is the principal term for glory in the Hebrew Bible. And what is striking about kavod is that it doesn't have the connotations that we often think about in relation to glory, the connotations of a bright, beautiful light or splendor. Rather, kavod has the root meaning of weight. So it's about the weight of reality that is being glimpsed when we see glory. And indeed, many of the references to the kavod Yahweh, the glory of the Lord, in the canonically early parts of the Hebrew Bible are not about beauty or blinding light, but they're mysterious and terrible rather than beautiful. So we see that in a whole range of texts in Exodus, in that amazing theophany in Isaiah 6, and in that extraordinary depiction of glory in Ezekiel 1. I leave it to you to go back and explore those passages. But I love this next quotation from Barbara Brown Taylor. The God of Moses is not the grandfatherly type, a kind old deity who can be counted on to take the kids exciting places without letting them get hurt. The God of Moses is holy, offering no seat belts or other safety features to those who wish to climb the mountain and enter the dark cloud of divine presence. Those who go assume all risk and give up all claim to reward. Those who return say the dazzling dark inside the cloud is reward enough. So she's getting here at that sense of the mystery and the depth of reality that is conveyed by the use of the word kavod in those Hebrew Bible passages. So, glory then is not necessarily about light or about beauty, but rather it consists of signs that show us something of the sheer reality of God, which necessarily, much of which remains hidden. And of course, for Christians, the quintessential sign of the godness of God is the incarnate Christ, and we see much reference to glory in the Gospel of John in particular. These two classic verses from the Johannine prologue testify to the sense that it is Christ who makes, who's the closest sign we can get to God, the one who makes God known. So it's all the more important then to recognize that in the Gospel of John, this glory, which is a repeated refrain through the Gospel, especially as it moves towards the Passion, that this glory in Jesus culminates in Jesus' hour, as the author puts it. And that hour is not merely the raising up of Jesus at the resurrection, but it is the raising up of Jesus on the cross. It is suffering and death as well as exaltation. So, although this is a contested area of Johannine study, but I would certainly want to defend the notion that Jesus' hour begins with the Passion, and that therefore, if this is Jesus' glorification, then glory here includes suffering and death. So there are three ways, it seems to me, in which we might be thinking about glory in relation to this kind of line of thought. And the first is the one that I've described, an apprehensible sign of the godness of God. Occasionally, though, you run into a text where glory seems to be speaking not so much of a sign as directly of the essence of God's nature. So in that wonderful passage in Exodus 33 that you may recall, Moses says, "Show me your glory." Well, he's already seen all these appearances of the Kavod Yahweh. So he's obviously, he's after something more, and the Lord says that he can't be allowed to see it directly. So here, glory is speaking much more directly about the godness of God. And a third way in which the term is often used is in relation to the human response to God, in relation to glorification. Well, what I want to do for the purposes of this talk is to bracket out that third sense, because it seems to me that what's being talked about there is praise and worship rather than God's glory in itself. So I want to concentrate on God's glory as a sign of the divine reality, and occasionally moving more into a direct reference to God's essence. But the dominant sense, it seems to me, is found in the idea of a sign of the divine reality. So I've set up then my concept of how I want to understand God's glory, and now I want to say a little more about where we might find it in the natural world. And it never takes me long when I'm thinking about the natural world to come to Gerard Manley Hopkins and this famous opening of his poem, God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Well, I wish Hopkins had written glory in that poem, because it would have been clearer and more conducive to my thesis. But actually, if you think about it, grandeur is a very similar word. It's a word about weight. It's a word about substance. And Hopkins' sense from his contemplations of nature is that he can see the world charged with this grandeur or glory. But what's important, and it's a continual refrain in my work, is that that we mustn't take too sentimental a view of the natural world. We must contemplate it as it is, with all the beauty and violence and struggle and suffering that it contains. So we must face up to the way that nature really is, rather than pretending that it's all lovely sunsets. So, I draw in the book quite a bit on this, this concept of trying to bear reality to the full. T.S. Eliot, in the first of 4 quartets, wrote this beautiful line, "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." It seems to me that we have a certain responsibility when we're trying to face honestly God's ways with the world and face honestly the reality of suffering. We have a certain responsibility to seek to bear reality as fully as we can. And of course, the Hebrew Bible contains a number of efforts to bear more reality than is normally done by human beings, and we have these wonderful resources in the Old Testament, especially in Job and Ecclesiastes and the Psalms. Also, more generally, in those texts that come out of the experience of suffering in exile. So now I want to provoke you thoroughly, and you'll have to just forgive me if I provoke you a little bit here, because in talking about God's glory in the natural world, and wanting to face up to the character of that natural world, then it does mean, it seems to me, engaging with the notion that God has given rise to the wonderful adaptation that we see in certain sorts of creatures, despite the fact that their lives are sustained by hunting other creatures down and killing them. I give you as my first example the golden eagle that tracks the mountain landscape and hunts down the hare. The hare twists and turns and seeks to escape, but the skill of the eagle is often too much for it. So God gives rise to creatures of superb ingenuity and beauty, although their skills often find expression in violence. Well, maybe that's all right. Maybe you let me get away with that as a sign of God's glory in nature. But I expect you might be more troubled if I say that the Indian Ocean tsunami has an element of that as well. It's clearly, this is very tricky territory given the colossal suffering that event caused. But viewed in another light, it's a reminder of the colossal tectonic forces that drive the continents and make the Earth a fruitful place for life. Terrible as the tsunami was, stemming from a tectonic slip of the power of thousands of hydrogen bombs, it's a reminder of the unimaginable power of the Creator expressed in this planet and its fruitfulness for life. Well, even if I got away with that, you might be even crosser if I say that the activities of parasitic entities like the malarial mosquito or our minds are very much shaped at the moment by COVID. Given the suffering that these pathogens have caused, their disruption of human life, how can I say that these are signs of God's glory? And all I'd say is that looking in detail into the life cycles of these entities shows you extraordinary creaturely ingenuity. And again, ultimately, this results from the possibilities that God created. So this is difficult glory indeed. And in order to contemplate it to the full and bear reality to the full, I think we need to place this contemplation in a larger theological scheme. And by the way, I don't, in what I've said might have culminated in the claim that even the human cruelty or human torture might be such an example, but I absolutely reject that because, of course, such activity, such cruelty reflects human choices, reflects defiance of God's will for human beings. And so I would absolutely exclude that type of moral evil from my analysis. But in broadening the theological lens, what I want to suggest is that it's useful to think about the same event in three ways in relation to glory. And then the first way is the one that we've been just been pondering, which is how God as creator has given rise to this world and the creatures within it, and how those creatures function in a measure as signs of God as creator and the character of God's creation. But the same event, it seems to me, must also be considered in the light of the cross, with all that that says to us about God's total identification with suffering through the suffering of Jesus on the cross, that God is never absent from the suffering of any creature. And also, the third lens of glory, which I want to suggest to you, is that eschatological promise that God ultimately will be all in all. That the struggle and suffering of this creation will ultimately be transformed by God's presence and God's redemption, so that enormously troubling as elements of the first creation are, they're never the end of the story, because we have a sense of the promise that rests with God ultimately, that this state of affairs is not the end of the story. And I find that a very helpful way of thinking about something like the COVID pandemic, that yes, we can understand it in terms of the created order that God has given. We have to understand it too in terms of God's identification with the suffering of the sufferers, and also with the notion that this world of struggle is not the last word, but that God will ultimately deliver the creation from it. So, as I promised, I'm working through a lot of material quite quickly, but just with the hope of sparking in you some thoughts and conversation, which I very much look forward to. I want to turn now for a moment to how glory might be seen in the work of artists and mystics and poets. I was enormously moved by the 9/11 memorial in New York City. It will be familiar to some of you, but perhaps not to others. I'm actually just going to read a short piece of description of it, because I do think it's a most astonishing construction. It consists of two massive granite-lined square hollows, each within the footprint of one of the destroyed towers of the World Trade Center. Within each of the hollowed-out areas, a deeper hollow sits, its base below the level to which the eye can travel. Water falls vertically down the outside walls, streams inwards, and falls down the inner well. The outer waterfalls flow fast, catch light, drift a little in the breeze. The sun evokes rainbows in the bouncing spray, and they find reflections in the dark walls. But that same water then slips, slides undramatically, relentlessly down the inner well into darkness. Occasional white roses are stuck into the names incised round the rim of the monument, telling reminders of the particularity of grief. The seemingly endless downward path of the falling water suggests that this grief goes as deep as grief can go. And for the believer, naturally, this is into the very heart of God and into divine depths beyond all human understanding. So this is, I think, a very profound metaphor for an aspect of divine reality that can be glimpsed through this nominally secular monument. It is, I think, a most astonishing piece of work. And I also wanted to call your attention to a painting which I expect is familiar to most of you, Piero della Francesca's Resurrection. I went into Umbria specifically to see this painting in a small town in the middle of nowhere, and came away with the most extraordinary impression. There's a kind of intensity and sternness in Christ's face that it seems to me calls one immediately into a state of repentance, and it's a kind of sign of God that seems to me very profound. But again, it's not a beautiful sign. This face is a face with death in it, although it's also a face of resurrection and of triumph. So I think there's a most extraordinary image here of God in Christ crucified and risen. So I invite you to think also about that in relation to glory. Well, I'm going to just give you a couple of poems from my chosen poet of glory, and then I'm going to move into the last section, which will be about, more specifically about what that glory means for us in the Christian life. So my chosen poet of glory is the Welsh priest poet R.S. Thomas, which perhaps might be surprising at first sight, because Thomas is so famous for his poems of doubt and search, rather than for his kind of proclamation in poetry. But he has these extraordinary, hard-won glimpses into something very special, which is exemplified, I think, first in this poem, The Bright Field. I've seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while, and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had the treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all that I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside like Moses to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you. So Thomas, seeing with that poet's eye a single sunlit field, is able to make a most extraordinary parable of glory out of it. And this is another lovely little poem. To one kneeling down, no word came, only the wind's song saddening the lips of the grave saints, rigid in glass, or the dry whisper of unseen wings, bats not angels, in the high roof. Was he balked by silence? He kneeled long and saw love in a dark crown of thorns blazing, and a winter tree golden with the fruit of a man's body. So this is a characteristic Thomas, the long, intense search, and then the sudden vision of more, of the vision that breaks through to the glory of the cross. So I'm going to skip a bit, although there were lots of fascinating further things that I might have said and which might come up in the discussion, because I want to come to the sense of what this means in the life of the Christian believer. And I want to approach that by means of this analysis of the nature of signs that comes out of C.S. Peirce. So Peirce, in his taxonomy of signs, distinguishes between three types of sign that relate the character of the sign to the character of the object. And we're not concerned here with the first two. What we're concerned with is this third, very difficult and elusive concept of the qualisign, where a sign represents its object by dint of its sheer quality. And the most familiar examples are those samples you would get of paint or perhaps wallpaper that enable you to see what your house will look like if you buy that particular product. A color sample of a particular color of paint is a sign of that color by dint of the sheer quality of it. And so I owe this this concept to the work of my colleague Andrew Robinson, because he makes the extraordinary and I think really helpful suggestion that the life of Jesus, taken as a whole, can be seen as a qualisign of the life of God. In other words, that the overall colour of Jesus' life is, as it were, the colour of the life of God itself. And that, of course, Jesus performs a whole series of other types of sign, but the overall colour of his life, it resembles the colour of the life of God. And so I go on from there to think about the possibility that in a limited and partial way, the lives of believers can approach more and more towards being that kind of qualisign, that the colour of people's lives might develop over a lifetime of formation, a truer and truer representation of the colour of Christ's life, in turn a sign of the colour of God's life. And I've been fascinated for very many years by this text from 2 Corinthians 3, all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image, from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. Well, that Greek verb that's reflected in the words in red there is one of the most disputed and tricky words in the whole of the New Testament. And I explore it a bit in the book, and I come to the conclusion, which is an interpretation which goes back into as far as Chrysostom, actually, that the verb can be understood as not only seeing but also reflecting the glory of the Lord, so that as Christians contemplate the colour of Christ's life, they might themselves come over time, gradually and gradually and gradually, more truly to reflect that colour, being transformed from one degree of glory to another. And perhaps it's particularly appropriate to be thinking in those terms in this place, because my perception is that the monastic life and institutions that grow around it are there for the long haul, that the witness of the life of somebody committed, whether formally or informally, around a monastic rule, that life is not about particular instance where the person did a particularly amazing thing or raised a particularly striking amount of money, or taught the kindergarten for a year. It's much more about the overall witness of that life over the long haul, and about that sense that that gradually, such a life can take on more and more of the colour of Christ's life. And it reminded me of that great saying of Irenaeus of Lyon, of which the first part is so well known: the glory of God is a human being fully alive. The second part is less well known, that the human life is the contemplation of God. So what we see there in that saying of Irenaeus is, in reverse order, as it were, that same perception that we get in 2 Corinthians 3, that the second part is the contemplation, the seeing of God's glory, and the first sentence is the reflection of that glory in the Christian life. So I've offered you, as I promised, a very rapid canter through a lot of arguments, and I am sure that there are many things that on which you may have stubbed your toe, but I'm delighted that you're still sitting there, and that therefore we might have some conversation on the basis of what I've said. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for questions now. And thinking, since we're a small group and you all are kind of comfortable sitting there, the easiest thing would be for me to just carry the mic around to you. So just raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. We need to use the mic because we're recording this for
There are
posterity.
two troublemakers in the front row, and then
Four
one
already.
behind. Splendid.
Chris, thanks so much. It's a wonderful lecture. You've given me so much food for thought here. As you were speaking, however, I kept expecting you to start talking about the suffering of God. So I'm thinking here of Elizabeth Johnson's book, Quest for the Living God, where she quite aggressively said that it's not just a matter of Jesus suffers, and in that suffering in some way reflects God's solidarity with the world, but she made a point and got into trouble on this point with the American bishops, and was then vindicated because Pope John Paul II said the same thing about God suffering. But anyway, she made a quite an aggressive point about saying that God suffering enters into the very being of God. And since what you're dealing with is suffering is so manifest in the world, and suffering is an aspect of life which we cannot escape. It has to do with natural evil as well as the evil of human beings. I guess I just want to ask, is that idea of the glory of God being God's, deep incarnation into creation, such that God takes on suffering into the very being of God? Is that something which is a part of your thinking at all?
Thank you very much, Vincent. In relation to natural evil, I would take that exact same line and say that when any creature capable of suffering suffers, then God suffers with that creature, and that the passion and cross of Jesus are represent God's uttermost commitment to solidarity with suffering, but it's there for millions of years beforehand. Yes, in the deer torn apart by the saber-toothed tiger, and so on and so forth. And now, of course, there's a theological squabble about divine passibility, as you know so well. But it seems to me that actually perhaps it's less of a squabble than it appears, because even impassibilists would have to say that God was as close to that suffering creature as the creature itself, that God's immanent presence with the creature is very intimate. And even people who want to embrace divine passibility have to acknowledge that the difference between divine and creaturely suffering is that God is not destroyed by suffering in the way that creatures can be. But yes, the short answer is I would very much go down that line. Yeah. Thanks. I think it could be you.
Thank you. I share Vincent's appreciation for your thoughtfulness and can you hear me? And your insight. And I want to pick up where Vincent went and where you're going. You were just going there. The question of divine suffering can be thought to be related to this whole issue of divine omnipotence or all-powerfulness. And I appreciate your wanting to move from theodicy to doxology, and I'm happy to grant that doxology ultimately is more important than theodicy. I appreciate that. And yet, the questions of theodicy don't go away for you or for any of us.
Sure. Yeah.
So I do think this question of omnipotence is a very important one. It's been raised by a lot of theologians. I'm particularly familiar with Jewish theologians who have challenged this, particularly modern and contemporary ones. For example, Heschel says that divine omnipotence is a non-Jewish idea. Well, obviously a lot of Jews have had the idea, but he's saying it's not something at home in what he believes to be the rabbinic tradition, where there is an emphasis on the suffering of God within the Talmud and in the other rabbinic writings. Another Jewish philosopher, Hans Jonas, for example, has said, and this relates to your wonderful theme of the godness of God. He says, he says we have to ask what really makes God God? Okay, says Jonas. And he said, goodness, pure goodness, no taint of anything but goodness, is non-negotiable. He says, so God, as all good, is non-negotiable. But he says that omnipotence is negotiable. In fact, he thinks that though there are attestations to divine omnipotence within biblical writings and in some medieval Jewish writings, for example, and certainly in Christian writings in the Middle Ages and beyond, he says, really, if you think about it, what makes God worthy of worship is not all powerfulness, but all goodness. And so I'm just wondering what you make of that. I just want to relate it to something else that both Jonas and Heschel and some other philosophers, theologians say, that creation need not include the idea of design, and the idea that God is somehow at work in the tsunami. They would all agree, by the way, with you that ultimately God is responsible for the fact that there is suffering in the world because God created the world. But the ones I'm thinking of don't think of God as directly causing the suffering, because what I'm thinking of is those who say that, and I'm wondering what you think of this, that creation need not include the concept of design or the concept of plan. And that reminds me of somebody who Vincent and I have both assigned, and maybe some other people here have assigned in class, John Haught, who says we shouldn't think of God as having a plan, but having a vision. So God has a vision for the way God wants the world to be, but doesn't plan things out and isn't in control. So these are some of the thoughts that have influenced me and have made me think that not that the mystery goes away or not that the theodicy problems are completely solved by any means. And again, I agree with you, doxology is more important, praising God is much more important. But they've helped me, think that, well, we don't necessarily have to think that God wants that tsunami to happen, because God didn't necessarily, design and doesn't control the world. So I'll leave it at that. That's a little bit longer than I expected to.
Well, it's an extraordinarily rich question and sets all sorts of hairs running. So I qualify God's omnipotence by saying that actually the only sort of way to give rise to this sort of world was this suffering-filled way, that God didn't have other options. But less and less attracted to those philosophical absolutes of omnipotence and indeed omnibenevolence, because it seems to me that that what we have is the story of God, who is the reason why there's anything and not nothing, and who through the incarnation, cross, and resurrection transforms the state of the creation, and will ultimately wrap it up in a way that we can't even picture. That's the God we know, the God of that story, and I think it's more important to stay with the shape of that story and the mystery of it than to wrestle out those more abstract concepts. We could talk a lot more, but yeah, that's a start anyway.
Thank you very much. Like I said, I was really excited coming here because I was told you're from the UK, and I was looking forward to the British English. Okay, so I have two questions. The first one is, are you conceding that without sin, that natural evil was part of the plan of God? So, because it's kind of obvious that the fall of man brought about moral evil. So was the other natural evil part of the plan of God? I mean, earthquake and the others? And are you saying that did the fall not cause an increase in the natural evil that came into the world, like distort God's original plan? Did it increase suffering when it comes to the natural evil, like natural disasters? Secondly, I have a question. You talked about Jesus' suffering on the cross. There's a popular saying that as a Christian, you have to choose between the Christless cross and the crossless Christ. In other words, suffering has to be attached to glory. Like I'm attempting to divide it. For suffering has to be attached to glory for suffering to make sense. But you are telling us that suffering makes sense in itself. And that seems like, theological problem. Jesus' suffering was tied to the fact that he did it as an extra, some people would say it was not a necessity. He did it out of love. And why? Because for our sins, in order to restore our relationship with God. So I have a problem with, as a Christian, suffering doesn't make sense in itself without being attached to a bigger vision, a bigger goal. And that's the whole purpose of Christian hope. So that's my confusion with trying to, allow suffering stand on its own.
I think those are great questions, and the second one is really difficult for me. The first one is easier for me because I do think that there's a sense in which the inevitability of natural evil is part of the plan of God, and I don't think that the natural world was transformed by the sin of the first humans. I think it's always worked the way it worked. Of course, humans have inflicted a great deal more damage on it, but the world was not. It didn't go further downhill, in my view, because of the sin of the first humans. And there's some interesting work by my former student Bethany Solareda on the curse language of Genesis 3, and it might be interesting for you to explore that, because her view is that the curse is reversed at the end of the flood, and that and that there's no reason to suppose that the earth was lastingly cursed. Scientifically, I think that the way the world works is the way the world has worked. Does suffering make sense in itself? So much Christian theology has wanted to deny that and to say that evil has no real existence. And but I think, I do think that because biological processes contain an inextricable mixture of values and disvalues of progress and suffering, if you like, that therefore it is an inalienable part of the first creation. But of course, that's only the first act of the story, and we need to take the three-act story of creation, Christ event, and eschaton. We need always to be considering the whole of the story, and that's, to me, is what puts the suffering of the first creation into context. Is that some sort of help? So, yeah? Thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
Ah,
I just have a comment. You know, as I'm listening to you, I can't help but think of Julian of Norwich, because she wrestled with God around theodicy and just arrived at the place of saying, it is mystery, and all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. But it took her a while to get there.
yeah.
And it wasn't, she didn't say it this way, but it's not intellectually satisfying. It's not philosophically satisfying. But at heart,
Yes.
it is satisfying. And I think it's this, what you have as your final slide. It was her human life of the contemplation of God that brought her to all shall be well. And it's out of our, she talked about the privy council of God. And we're not privy
Yeah.
to that. So your wrestling, your own personal wrestling and writing reminds me of Julian's wrestling
Yeah.
and her writing. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that. And there's an interesting, I won't go on too long about this, but there's an interesting resonance with the previous question, actually, because a theologian called Karen Kilby in the UK has made a lot of use of Julian in her efforts to resist the notion that there's a kind of inbuilt tragic component to the Christian story, and she wants to say that indeed that the witness of Julian is that love wins through, and that suffering ultimately is incidental to it, rather than being integral to the way in which the drama of God unfolds. So she has this great argument with von Balthasar in her writing about this. But I kind of think that what we understand scientifically is a character witness for von Balthasar in this area, and that the tragedy is harder to get rid of. But Kilby's appeal to Julian is very interesting, and you might like to follow that up. I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. You raised a lot of great questions. I would like to just pick up briefly on your reference to glory and the Hebrew term kavod. And I think this last question that you were addressing about is the tragic vision of Christian life incidental, and that the suffering is, it just goes along with something deeper. So it's the question of deeper is what I'm interested in here, in the sense that kavod, if you talk about some person, there's really something to that person. They capture your attention, and that kind of weightiness that's there.
Yeah.
And it seems like somehow, if you talk about the story of the person's life, and I think that relates to Emily's point here, is that somehow that weightiness has emerged out of this almost inscrutable mixture of things that have worked well and things, but it involved a lot of, I'm jumping around here, but if you go back to, in terms of the suffering servant figure in Isaiah 53, to me, I've always interpreted that as this is where suffering finally got a positive valuation, in the sense that if you went with all the wisdom thinkers or whatever other prophets, suffering was payback. It was punishment for things that you'd done wrong. But somehow there's something that happens in that example of that suffering servant that creates perhaps compassion, bonding, vicarious suffering. It isn't really even what the suffering servant feels towards others. There's something about what happens there that transforms what's substantial.
Yeah.
So, and I think you're talking about that when you get into your understanding of glory. But anyway, I don't know if I have a whole, except to call attention to that kavod idea.
Well, that was very, very helpful, if I may say so, because I hadn't, in thinking about that 2 Corinthians 3 text, and that sense of being transformed from one degree of glory to another throughout a committed Christian life. I hadn't made that link back to kavod that you so helpfully made, so I'm really grateful for that. And of course, for reasons that we can't understand, that life is described as taking up one's cross, following in the footsteps of the servant, contemplating the servant raised up for our redemption. And so I think I agree with you that seems to embed the sense of tragedy within the story in ways that it's hard to get past. And I think, go back to Kilby, I don't think she's convinces me in that area. But it's such delicate ground, isn't it? I was in Noreen's class earlier today, and we were talking about the ways in which kind of deliberate mortification of the flesh in search of that suffering had, well, in my view, distorted Christian understanding. So it's delicate ground, isn't it? But I'm really grateful for what you pointed me to. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have one last question? Otherwise, we're rapidly approaching 9 o'clock. So perhaps we should just end here and thank Christopher again for coming to join us.